hello and welcome. And I'm here today with Dr. Sarah Ganty, who is a leading expert in immigration, human rights, rule of law issues within the European Union. And so those are some of the topics we're going to talk about today. And, immigration, if we can start with that, immigration, asylum, these are really highly contentious, highly political, often highly controversial areas, right, in politics, and the European Union is no exception there. But I suppose I could start by asking you, what are the EU's responsibilities in this area? Or is immigration and asylum, is that something that's mainly for each individual member state to deal with? So what kind of powers does the EU have in this area?
First, thank you for having me, Nicole. This is really a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for the audience, to the audience as well. So maybe, yes, indeed, immigration, asylum is an extremely contentious issue at EU level, and something we should keep in mind is that the EU is competent in immigration and asylum law. What does it mean is that since the signature of the Lisbon Treaty, there is now what we call the common immigration and asylum policy. But of course, this didn't kind of materialize in one day. Since Maastricht, the competencies of the EU has kind of evolved. And today we really see the EU basically building a legal framework regarding all what concerns the borders, the visa, the resident statuses, but also the rights that third country nationals can claim within the EU. So the EU is competent in the field of immigration and asylum law, but member states are still the one issuing the visas, issuing the resident statuses, etc. But they have, of course, to respect the legal framework set up by the EU.
Okay, so, we have these kinds of layers of law, right? We have the member states who are still, as you say, competent in these areas and who issue visas and who make decisions about who can and cannot become a citizen. And then EU law kind of overlays that, right, with a layer of protections, perhaps, rights, perhaps, duties, perhaps. So, at the moment...
If I can give you some examples, instance, when someone wants to claim asylum, of course we have the Geneva Convention, the international law, but then we have all the EU directive, what we call the qualification directive, which explains what criteria the member states have to take into account when assessing an asylum a claim, for instance. And these the member states have to respect. This is binding law by the member states.
Okay, so each member state then, there's a somewhat uniform system of judging who does and doesn't qualify for asylum. Another important aspect of the EU's asylum system framework, if you will, is the so-called Dublin regulation, right? And people may have heard of that. So could you please explain a little bit about what is that? What is the Dublin regulation? What does that entail?
So the principle behind the Dublin regulation is that basically the first country of arrival is the first country which has to deal with the asylum claim, which explains why Italy and Greece got a bit overloaded with all the asylum claims, since Dublin regulation says that the first country of arrival is the one which deals with the asylum claims, and then means that you have all the receptions directive applying, so how you have to welcome asylum seekers, how to have to deal with the asylum claim, and then how to have to treat refugees once they got this asylum recognized, the asylum rights recognized.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so this has created all sorts of tensions and problems within the European Union in many ways, right? And I think, you can say that you have this situation where amongst the member states, you could divide them into countries that are so-called frontline countries, and you mentioned Italy and Greece, right? And there are others where the bulk of asylum seekers tend to first arrive. And then the so-called countries of secondary migration, right? Which is, say, places like France or Germany or Sweden, right, where asylum seekers may prefer to be compared to Italy or Greece, right, and would be trying to get there. But one of the fundamental problems is that this sets up, these two groups of countries have different interests, right, in terms of what they want out of the asylum system. And I guess a theme that, we can get into a bit more as well is, the EU proclaims certain values, and then we always see in practice the tensions and the limitations of these values, right? So one of the values is solidarity, that the member states should show solidarity with one another. But this has been a problem, right, in trying to find a solution or a framework that works both for frontline states and for the countries of secondary migration, that there's a lack of kind of practical solidarity, would you say?
Yeah, and it was a huge issue, especially in 2000, in the aftermath of 2015, the so-called like refugee crisis, and there was this council decision about like the relocation of asylum seekers in a lot of countries, including Hungary, for instance, like refused to take their share in and even like disputed and went in front of the Court of Justice to request that the decision get annulled. The Court of Justice said that the decision was illegal, and that basically Hungary, which was supported by Poland, like had to respect these decisions, but in the end, like Hungary didn't relocate any asylum seeker here. So indeed, solidarity is a huge issue, but I think that solidarity is a big issue, but here we speak about the relationship between member states, and I think we also need to ask like what the system is at EU level and what's happening at borders. And I think it's we tend to focusing on this question of solidarity, how member states should share the burden, but I don't think it's a burden, but this is how it is presented, and I think it's also feed all the populist discourse in a sense. We need to ask ourselves, but how the EU, how does it work at EU level? And here maybe like we can speak later about the concept of lawlessness though, but I think that we tend to probably forget about the essential and about like about the fact that these people are human beings and have individual rights which are totally denied right now. So speaking about solidarity, it's an important issue, but I think first we need to speak about like what's happening at the borders and what the EU has built, what we call lawlessness now, in order to make sure that that the fact that migrants are denied any kind of individual right is not considered as a violation of EU law.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We need to get behind some of these terms. So burden obviously is a loaded term, right? You're just to speak in the abstract of a burden, right? And we can't lose sight of the fact that we are talking about human beings, right? Just as a burden that has to be relocated or distributed from here to there, right? Like a quantity. And even the notion of solidarity, you're right, is problematic because it's very much a kind of an intra-EU solidarity, right? So who does that exclude? So I think actually, that takes us nicely to this concept that you've written about and that you just mentioned, lawlessness law, right? Which I guess sounds like a bit of a contradiction in terms, right? That's a bit odd, right? How can law be lawless? So maybe you could start by just describing what does that concept mean? What is lawlessness law?
Yeah, it's maybe explaining first, because it's a paper we co-authored with Dmitry Kochinov, who will be interviewed later, I think, here. But maybe we can we can start with how we came to this concept, and we observed with horror all the death in the Mediterranean, and at one point we asked ourselves, but the fact that you have 25,000 people who have died in the Mediterranean for more than 8 years. This doesn't happen by chance. And so what we started doing in this paper, and what we started investigating, is basically what is the legal mechanism behind which allows these 25 people to die into the Mediterranean. And this is what we call lawlessness law. So lawlessness law is basically all the legal techniques which are put in place by the EU to make sure that denying third country national rights or migrants' rights is never perceived as a violation of EU law. So it's basically based on I would call nationality segregation. So it's just because of your citizenship, of your nationality, there is of course some racial aspects behind, but it's because of your nationality that you are denying these rights, and that it's never perceived as a violation of EU law. And this lawlessness law techniques operates inside the EU, but also outside the EU. So inside the EU, it's very easy to understand. Like EU citizens have rights. Third country nationals do not benefit from all the free, the freedom of movement, the free market, and basically they are denied the most important right, the freedom of movement and the prohibition based on nationality. So this is inside the EU. But outside the EU, what we see is that there is this system which is built by the EU in order to make the rights of third country nationals, when we speak about rights, these are human rights, the right to life, the right to claim asylum, the right not to be subject to torture and inhuman treatment. So all these rights are denied by the EU, are made ephemeral, and the EU built the system as such as it's never presented as a violation of EU law. So I'm happy to give some examples afterwards to be a bit more concrete, but it's very important to keep in mind that what's happening in the Mediterranean or also at the Belarusian border, because there is also a lot of terrible things happening at the Belarusian border, is not happening by chance. It's based on a legal system as designed. So this is what we argue in the paper.
Okay, so fundamentally you're describing this really key divide between haves and have-nots, and it's based on citizenship, right? There's this division of haves and have-nots that really goes back to the citizenship you hold, which is an accident of birth, right? And that this is a system constructed. So, I mean, it sounds, it kind of ties in with this idea that when the EU created Schengen, and again, solidarity and freedom of movement, and isn't this great for Europeans? But at the same time that, on the external border, it created this kind of fortress Europe situation, right? And so you're talking about the legal system that's set up to support this. So I suppose if we could get a bit more concrete, say an individual who has not yet reached Europe but is trying to reach Europe in order to claim asylum, right? Once they reach what they would like to claim asylum, what rights, concretely, what rights does this person have?
That's the whole problem. That person has some rights, including the right of non-refoulement. So when that person arrives, for instance, on the territory or is in the Mediterranean, close to the EU territory, this person has a right not to be refoulé, so not to be sent back to where he or she comes from, and then to have his or her asylum claim being reviewed by Italy, by Greece, by one of the EU country. And here what's happening is that the EU put in place a system in order for this person not to be able to claim her rights and not to be able to have her rights recognized. How does that happen? There are different techniques put in place. So we have first Frontex. Frontex, which is the European Border and Coast Guard Agency. And it's interesting because this agency was first the European Anti-Fraud Office, and it became much later an agency which deals with borders. And this agency in 2004 had a budget of 6 billion, and now in 2023 it has a budget of 900 billion. So it grew and expanded tremendously. Now it assists member states in the return of third country national. It does a lot of things. It also assists them in controlling the borders. It has its own coast guards. So it has immense power in the way it can intervene in the control of borders. And there are many issues with these agencies. That first, the problem of many hands. So there are proofs and there are clues that Frontex has observed and is even sometimes involved in what we call pushbacks, meaning that migrants are pushing back to the Libyan waters to make sure that they don't enter the EU. This is against international law. This is against the principle of non-refoulement.
So these are people who are in the sea, and the boats they're in are being pushed back towards the North African coast, away from the European Mediterranean coast.
Exactly.
And this is illegal.
And this is illegal. And this is illegal. But then what's happening in order for Frontex not being all accountable, in order for the EU not being all accountable, is, for instance, what we call the problem of many hands. There are many different actors involved. There is Frontex, there is, of course, the national border guards, the Italian, the Greek ones. There are also some private actors, and there is also the technology, so drones. So, for instance, Frontex, which has drones, will just see some migrants being in the Mediterranean and asking for help, hoping to reach the Italian coast or the Greek coast. And what Frontex will do is basically alert the Libyan Coast Guard to say, look, there are some people here who are in distress. Please, Libyan Coast Guard, save them. But what does it mean being saved by Libyan Coast Guard? And now it has been like documented widely. These people are either put into slavery, either killed by the Libyan Coast Guard, or imprisoned in indecent conditions in prisons in Libya, where they're basically asked to pay a lot of money in order to be released. So they basic human rights, whether they are dying into the Mediterranean or whether they are brought back to the Libyan coast, these people are in a sense tortured and exposed to inhuman treatments. So this is what's happening. So this is the Frontex, the problem of many hands. It's impossible to identify who is responsible. So this is probably the first problem. The second problem is transparency. We don't know what's happening. Like we keep asking Frontex a lot of documents about what's happening there, what they are doing, about the activity, etc. But since we don't have the information, how can we basically like go to court and say, look, Frontex is responsible. We don't have the information here. And the third problem is that it's almost impossible to bring Frontex in front of the court. So the court of the European Court of Justice is the one who is responsible when there is anything concerning Frontex, and it's impossible basically to have an effective remedies when these kind of things happened. And so we have a problem here of accountability. There is clear violation of EU law, but EU law is built, there is clear violation of human rights, but EU law is built as such as, like, it's never presented as a violation of EU law. So this is one of the big issues.
But so what you describe, and especially this total lack of accountability, lack of remedies, lack of transparency, this really clearly runs counter to the principle of the rule of law, right, which is meant to be a core value of the European Union, right, the rule of law. So we have a real conflict here between stated values and practice. So, I mean, how does the European Union, I mean, we're probably familiar with this term of the EU as a normative power, right? It kind of stands by its values. Its values, that's what the European Union is. It's not a nation state. So how does the EU justify what seems to be such a blatant contradiction between stated values, especially the principle of the rule of law, and these practices you describe?
But the EU is behind this old system, and that's the issue, is that the EU builds this system especially in order to present it as there is no violation of the rule of law, as there is no violation of these basic rights. So I think this is one of the core issue of all of this, is that the EU put the blame, for instance, on migrants, on smugglers, but never ask itself whether it has its own responsibility. And the problem here is that I think that the Court of Justice is the high priest of lawlessness now. So the Court of Justice has also its own responsibility, in the sense that some cases were brought in front of the court, and the court, especially when we know this EU-Turkey deal, I don't know if you have heard about this EU-Turkey deal, basically, which was...
Maybe you could explain the basics of this EU-Turkey
and it's also part of the lawlessness law legal techniques, I would say, is that the EU kind of remove from international laws some international agreements in order to make sure that these agreements cannot be disputed. So it's the case, for instance, with readmission agreements. So readmission agreements are these agreements which are concluded on the one hand with the EU and on the other hand with the third country, to make sure that third country nationals who are undocumented in the EU are brought back to the
means
country.
They can be sent back to Turkey, for example.
Exactly, to Turkey, or to even African countries, Ethiopia, or even Afghanistan, etc. And this readmission agreement fall under the realm of international law. So these are agreements, if basically there are some issues with this agreement, you should be able to dispute them. But what the EU has done with some countries, including Ivory Coast, Guinea, Afghanistan, Gambia, is that it has concluded some readmission agreement with them under soft law, meaning that the EU take outside of the realm of international law these agreements, and then people who are actually affected by this agreement, because they are returned to their country where they don't want to be, cannot dispute these agreements. And so we see that the EU put all of this in a kind of shadow immigration less law system, and which is extremely problematic, I think. And coming to the EU-Turkey deal, we call it EU-Turkey deal, and I think we should continue to speak about the EU-Turkey deal. It was this deal between the EU on the one hand and Turkey on the other hand, following the so-called refugee law crisis in 2015, and the EU promised to pay Turkey 3 billion, and there was this one-to-one deal. It was so Turkey would send to the EU one good refugee, and the EU would send one bad refugee back to Turkey. And we learned about this deal just on the website of the council someday out of nowhere. Like, we learned about this deal. So, like, for even all the practitioners, for all the academics, like, this deal was concluded on the one hand by the EU, and on the other hand, and with Turkey on the other hand. And then some applicants went to the court asking, like, and disputed this agreement, and the council said, no, I have nothing to do with this agreement. Basically, like, these are member states who concluded this agreement, not the EU. And the Court of Justice upholds this argument and say, indeed, the EU has nothing to do with this agreement. These are member states, so this is member states' problem. So it's basically impossible to bring in front of the Court of Justice this kind of deeply problematic agreement which violates international law and basic human rights and EU law as well.
So really what you're describing is a really systematic, concerted effort to render asylum seekers legally invisible. Invisible from the legal system.
Not only asylum seekers, migrants in general.
Migrants in general.
Yeah.
I suppose if I can, I'm wary of the time, but if I can bring it up to some things that are going on at the present, right? The EU is in the process with its member states of negotiating a new pact on migration and asylum. So does this new pact, in your view, does it tend to reinforce lawlessness law, or does it take the EU in a more humane direction?
No, unfortunately, and it's not going into the right direction. It's going into the direction of lawlessness law, and we have a very good example of what we call the fiction of entry, which is proposed in the pact. So the fiction of entry means that someone, a migrant who has actually entered the EU and who is supposed to benefit from all the asylum rights, so having his or her asylum claim, like processed as any other refugees, this person is deemed as having not entered the EU, meaning that all the rights which are supposed to apply to this person won't be applied here, which is again a perfect example of what lawlessness law is. Basically, we make sure to deny rights to third country nationals while presenting it as a non-violation of EU law, since it's part of EU law, which is to me deeply problematic.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, we've mostly focused on very negative topics, so I suppose if I can ask one last question and then maybe we'll finish up. Do you see any hope for a kind of positive change? I mean, in addition to the kind of actors that make possible lawlessness law, I mean, there are a lot of actors working in the civil society space, right, going in the other direction. So do you see kind of any pressure coming for a positive change in this area?
I think, like, in the civil society and especially organizations, they are doing an amazing job, but they are really struggling also because they are like underfunded. So I think they are extremely important in the sense that they are giving the information. So there are so many reports, there are so many videos, there are so many things, like journalists like denouncing what's happening. So these are already like doing an amazing job, but what we miss now is basically raising awareness of the population. And I think here, and you will say it's more like a negative tone rather than a positive tone, but the populists like play a terrible role, because instead of just like and politicians in general just trying to have a very positive discourse towards migrants, because this is basically like the future of Europe, having all these migrants coming here. Like, we can have a very utilitarian perspective saying, oh, they will pay pay for pensions, but which is true. They will pay for pensions, but also in terms of cultural diversity and in terms of opportunities. Like these people are likely to bring so much to the EU, and I think that having a much more like positive discourse about what they can bring, who they are, would help tremendously also in terms of raising awareness and seeing them as human beings. Because I think right now what's happening is that people in Europe in general are unable to see them as human beings, which is deeply problematic. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Sarah Ganty, for your time.
And thank you,
for
Nicole.
being here
I
with
really
us.
appreciate it.